Hello, it is I, RP, your host for this channel, The Relatively Overworked. It's still 2024 as of recording. I'm not sure if I'm able to put this video out before Christmas. If I do, then Merry Christmas. If not, then Happy New Year. I've been very busy with my own day job the past month or so, and it's going to get even more busy as time goes by. So I'm trying to squeeze as much time to record some new content for you as much as possible. And for today's video, I just wanted to talk about Singaporean motorcycle culture and how things work in Singapore, because the next few videos I've planned is probably going to involve talking to the people in Singapore and how they impact the motorcycle community, or how motorcycling has impacted them as Singaporeans or people that live in Singapore. So the first thing I want to talk about is, if you are from somewhere else in the world and you've only been in Singapore for a while, you kind of have noticed that a lot of the bikes in Singapore are mostly stock and pretty pristine. Namely, like this, for the most part, is pretty stock in terms of the performance. And I mean, it's not pristine, it's not clean. I hate cleaning my bike. But in general, most Singaporean riders, they keep their bikes pretty well maintained. And this is coming from traveling around the world, I mean, Japan excluded, but most bikes I've seen around the world, they are pretty shit. I mean, unless you are namely in the enthusiast level market, where people would generally keep their bikes pretty good and working condition. But even the so-called kapchai or underbone market in Singapore, that is used by mostly the working class people, they are pretty well maintained in Singapore. And there is a good reason for that, because in Singapore, unlike in most other countries, once you buy it, you are quite unlikely to be subjected to inspections, uh, or rather following a certain standard on an annual basis. In Singapore, other than the first and second year of your ownership of a brand new off the dealership bike, you have to go back to get your bike inspected, and it has to pass before you're allowed to keep the bike on the road or in your ownership. If not, you get fined. It can get really expensive when we're talking about fines. That's why a lot of people keep their bikes very well maintained, just so that it can pass that inspection. Another thing that, if you are in, it's not really unique to Singapore. It's pretty common in Malaysia, in Thailand, and pretty much most of Southeast Asia, is that a lot of motorcyclists in our part of the world, having a top case luggage is the norm. Like, I know I don't have one here to demonstrate my point, because I don't like the look of it, but in Singapore and in Malaysia and Thailand, having a top case is pretty much par for the course. Everybody has one. Nearly everybody has one, actually. And this is really because, unlike in most Western countries, like the US, Europe, Australia, even in other more developed places like Japan, motorcycling is not really seen as just a hobby. In Asia, the motorcycle is a legit mode of transportation everywhere, because why? We've got really good moderate temperatures all year round. I mean, sure, it gets rainy and it pours like 200 out of 365 days a year. And let me tell you, what you guys call like a typhoon, or what kind of natural disaster in Japan or the UK, that's just another Sunday to us. And speaking of the weather, that brings me to the other point. Now, you do see me wear a full face helmet, a jacket, boots, gloves, most of the time in my videos, if I do show myself wearing my full gear in my videos. But there is a very different focus when it comes to the kind of gear that Singaporeans generally wear. Now, this is because in Singapore, it's pretty hot, it's pretty humid. Unlike in Europe, where the norm is wearing a full face helmet, leather jackets, boots, leather gloves. In Singapore, most people prefer having a half helmet for better airflow to the face, better breathability. Usually most won't even have a jacket. They won't wear boots. Most will either have covered shoes or sandals in the event of rain. And this isn't really because Singaporeans can't afford it, because I do know that in other parts of Southeast Asia, it is a legitimate reason why people don't wear full gear. Like if you would ask a Indonesian or a Thai person if they actually were educated about the benefits of wearing gear, as well as being afforded the luxury of being able to purchase them, they would choose to buy that. But in Singapore, Singaporean riders are genuinely educated about the benefits of safety gear, as well as of course blessed with the luxury of earning enough money to make it easy to actually buy all of this. And it's funny because people come to Singapore and they realize that Singaporeans don't really wear protective gear much. They rather, the most people would have is a raincoat, and that's about it. It's starting to change, but it's still not really a norm yet. Another thing I kind of thought about is that there is sort of a very different focus in the way Singaporean riders choose what bikes they want. There is a heavy emphasis on what we call chasing bigger CCs or CC entitlement, where Singaporean riders, they would choose the biggest possible displacement bike they can legally ride, because in Singapore we have tiered licensing structures. So when you first start riding, the first license you are going to get is 200cc, and then 400, and then everything else, the world opens up to you. So in Singapore, there is a very different mindset when deciding what kind of bike to buy. Most of the people I've seen, at least when they are within the first 10 years of their riding career, they generally would buy the biggest bike they can possibly afford, and their license allows it. Because, okay, I've got my 400cc license, why am I going to waste time buying something smaller? I've already done 1 year on that. When I was on my 200cc license, and then now I've got my 400, I should get a 400, and then once I get my full license, I should be going for a 1000 R1. So that is pretty much how Singaporeans really think about their motorcycle purchases. Of course, in most other places in the world, like especially the US, for example, where there's no tiered licensing structure, they just buy whatever the hell they want. And even in Japan and the EU, where there are tiered licensing structures, they are not a progressive one. So you don't have to suffer going through a 200, 400, and something else. Because once you reach a certain age, like for example 23 years of age in the EU, you are able to straight away apply for the largest license that you can get, and then get whatever the hell you want. So most of the time when I talk to European and Japanese riders, the way they think about how they buy bikes is a lot more different compared to us Singaporeans. They are very application focused. If they want to buy a dirt bike, they'll buy something specifically for the application, regardless of how big the engine is. Another thing I wanted to talk about is how, contrary to the fact that Singapore is such a small country, it's only about 700 square kilometers. In Singapore, what you call low mileage is surprisingly high, and this applies to both cars and bikes. So my motorcycle here is a 2018 Ducati Scrambler Sled. I've got about 20,000 kilometers on the odometer on this. This is considered incredibly low mileage for a motorcycle in Singapore, because let's take 20,000 divide by 6 years. How many was that? 612. It's about 2,000-3,000 kilometers a year that I've clocked. For 2,000-3,000 kilometers clocked a year, that is generally considered on the upper end of what most other people in other countries call low mileage. So In say the US, I've seen people consider 6,000 kilometers clocked a year as something considered as low mileage to them. But in Singapore, if you clock anything less than 12,000 kilometers a year, you are basically not using and maximizing your bike. That is considered a low mileage bike, and people actually like that kind of reading on the odometer if they calculate that the bike is used for like less than 12,000 kilometers every single year. Now, the reason why Singaporeans ride so much on their vehicles despite the apparent lack of size and roads in Singapore is really very simple. Singapore has this thing called the COE, where you buy a entitlement to have this machine on the road in your possession for the next 10 years, and it's very expensive. And apart from that, there is a lot of fixed costs associated with owning something like this. Actually, literally any bike in Singapore, there are a lot of fixed and sunk costs associated that you had to pay upfront before you're even gonna get a motorcycle. So most Singaporeans, when we first get our motorcycles, they can cost up to $50,000 for a bike that when imported in from the manufacturer probably costs 20 grand at most. So this leads to Singaporeans having this sunk cost mentality where, all right, I've already paid 50 grand on this hunk of metal. It is not going to do me any good if it just sits in the parking lot doing absolutely nothing. So I am going to use it as much as possible to amortize that cost across the longest possible mileage as possible that I can clock. So that is really the kind of mentality that goes with Singaporean riders and drivers. Actually both have the exact same mentality, and this runs contrary to the intentions of the Singaporean government in reducing private vehicle use. They want people to use the train, they want to use the bus, the taxis. But then when they introduce that plan, those upfront costs to deter vehicle ownership, it just backfired, and people that actually started buying them, they began using it more because it is the marginal cost of actually driving based on things like petrol and wear and tear. They are really playing second fiddle to the upfront cost that every owner has to pay upfront. I guess another thing that Singaporeans are generally well known for is the fact that there is a lot of government overreach on a lot of things related to motorcycles. When I went to Japan and when I went to LA and I went to London, while obviously things like customs aren't literally everywhere, it is a lot more common than you would find in Singapore. Even because the thing is, in a lot of these places, even Japan is very notorious for their regulations on what can be done or what cannot be done to customize your bike. But in Singapore, the kind of regulations and government overreach on what you can do is something that would make literally any American or even any European balk at. So for example, something that's very common in the rest of the world that I've seen is something called a fender eliminator, because you got this huge chunky ugly ass tail fender that holds your license plate. You're not allowed to change that. Your pipes, you technically are able to change that, but the problem is it takes so much effort to get it privately homologated for as much as $30,000. If you are the first one on hand, that is not even worth it. So usually people only get pipes if for some reason the dealerships that are selling it decide to put down that money to get it homologated for that specific model year and specific bike and that specific exhaust. And even then, the only thing that you can usually change for a motorcycle is just the end can, which to most people, it's not really worth it. It used to be more common in the past when motorcycle ownership was a lot cheaper and people were feeling the effects of the economic boom in Singapore. But as time has gone by, like in the economic climate now, it's like, God forbid I'm trying to think about doing that to my bike, because I'm going to end up putting like 5 grand just to change a stupid end can that does nothing except sound nicer. Even colors is something that you're not allowed to change. The fairings is not allowed to it's not something you're allowed to change if you have a sport bike. So if let's say you have an old R1 that you crash and you don't want to put down another 3,000 just to buy a brand new OEM fairing, sorry man, you gotta put that $3,000 down, because if you don't replace the fairings with an OEM one and you convert it into a Street Fighter for like maybe $600, $700 just to save money, it's not gonna pass in Singapore. That's why a lot of people in Singapore, there's no culture of modifying their bikes beyond like probably pasting stickers and some really cosmetic accessories like your bar grips and your hand levers and maybe hand guards, for example. Another thing, I'm not sure if it's the same in the rest of the world, because as far as Japan is concerned, when I'm there, it's very corporate. When you want to buy a bike, you want to rent a bike, everything is by the books. The prices are pretty transparent. There's no real avenue to haggle too much. But in Singapore, the way dealerships operate, it's kind of like a very personal thing. A lot of dealerships, they operate on relationships. Now that's because in Singapore, most of the dealerships in Singapore, they are very old conglomerates from like 1920s, very traditional companies, and even the smaller dealerships, they are owned by mostly boomer types and their descendants, and all these small, very traditional Chinese companies. They have this, what we call a Chinese businessman's mindset, where, you know, I scratch your back, you scratch my back, we build a community, and it's all about knowing the people, and that's how you get better deals, first dips on the nice stuff. If you're just like a brand new customer that, you know, nobody in the company knows, you don't know anybody, you've not built that connection with a lot of the community, you just get ripped off. The last topic, I don't really know if I want to talk about it, but you know, why not? It's a very sensitive topic, but it's something that is very obviously observed in Singapore, what with our multiracial society, is that in most countries I've been, most places I've been, they are pretty homogeneous. Like if you go to Germany, there's a lot more Germans than anybody else. So the biker communities in those so-called biker bars, they are mostly German. In Japan, it's mostly Japanese. What the hell am I stumbling over simple words like that? And of course, in the US, even with their multicultural, or rather melting pot nature of a society where you can be any skin color, but at the end of the day, everybody kind of thinks pretty much the same as Americans. But in Singapore, despite having a so-called multicultural society where 70% of the citizens are people like me with light skin tone, East Asian descent, Chinese, and only maybe about 20%-ish. I mean, the demographics has changed quite a bit, but give or take is about 15 to 20% are Malays, and the rest are a mix of Indians and people of other international descents. But it's funny because if you were to go to any biker event, it is almost exclusively, for the most part, dominated majority by Malay attendees. And this is something that is very funny to me, statistically speaking, because if you got 70% Chinese, you'd probably see a majority of Chinese motorcyclists in events and places. But it's not hard to understand why the Chinese population in Singapore kind of bulk at becoming bikers. There is a huge difference in the cultures of Chinese people and Malay people in Singapore. As much as we like to all call ourselves Singaporeans, but Singapore is relatively homogeneous within its individual racial communities. Malays have their own way of life, Chinese have their own way of life, and the Indians also too have their own way of life. And things generally don't mix too much. There are some shared ideas, especially with regards to cuisine, but the ideas on what is the most valued thing in each society is very different, and they don't really transfer. And I mean, ideas don't transfer much as well, because interracial marriage is still very rare in Singapore. The first thing to come to mind to explain why Chinese in general don't ride bikes is that Chinese culture tends to value prosperity, wealth, status a lot. So in Singapore, even though motorcycles are relatively expensive compared to the rest of the world, to be honest, Chinese are incentivized to buy things like cars, which are even more expensive as a symbol of wealth. So there are more Chinese individuals, when they want to buy a vehicle, they feel more pressure to buy a car, and especially, more importantly, a nice car than a motorcycle. The other thing that explains why there's less Chinese proportionally riding motorcycles in Singapore is because Chinese values also abhor risk in general. Chinese people avoid danger and risky things as much as possible. So when it comes to motorcycles, that is the nature of a motorcycle ride. It's risky. That's why nobody, not saying nobody, I am a Chinese and I'm riding a motorcycle, but it's very rare to convince a Chinese dude or a Chinese girl to actually get into riding motorcycles. Now, the Malays, on the other hand, I am not going to say this is a educated thing. This is purely my own opinions on what I feel Malay culture values, is that Malay society tends to value, number one, first of all, in successive order, first of all, God, second, family, and third is happiness. That's why after you deal with the whole God and family issue thing, being a primarily Muslim racial group, they next prioritize individual happiness, obviously without taking away from the whole family and God aspect of things. It has to satisfy the first two. But individual happiness is very important to most Malay people I've met. So when it comes to things like hobbies, Malays tend to be much more keen on taking up things that they feel happy doing, which a lot of them, they enjoy fast cars, fast bikes. If it's something they can afford, they'll do it. So you'll see there tends to be a meme in Singapore about the Malay dude starter pack, cigarettes, fishing, motorcycles, and music. So I hope this helps give you some insight of what Singaporean motorcycle culture, or rather the culture of people here that ride bikes, look like. And if you have any other things, especially my Singaporean and Malaysian buddies, especially my Malaysian buddies out there, if you notice something very weird about Singaporean riders in general, do leave them down in comments below. This is mostly what I can really get at the top of my head, but as a Singaporean, sometimes you don't see things for what they are, that other people from other countries have noticed. Especially from my Japanese friends, they notice a lot of weird things about Singapore that I don't even realize that it's that odd and very different from the rest of the world. If you enjoyed this video, do give me a like, subscribe, thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. Peace out, bye bye.